Thanks everybody for joining. Great. Well, I show 7 o'clock, 7:01, so let's get started. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. It's a beautiful day and a beautiful evening out in Maryland. I'm Delegate Brooke Lehrman, and I represent, along with my teammates, Senator Bill Ferguson and Delegates Robin Lewis and Lou Klippinger, the Fightin' 46, the 46th District in Baltimore City. But of course, we work at a statewide level to pass and implement policies that help all Marylanders thrive and help our communities grow. Before we begin, and I'm delighted to have a really amazing panel of folks here today, but before we begin, just a couple points about where we are and why I host these webinars. I really believe strongly that being a delegate is about more than passing legislation. It's about connecting people with the resources that they need, driving discussions about important topics, and really advocating for change in a number of ways, including through discussions like this one. Government is about reducing barriers to success and creating opportunities for all and keeping our residents safe. And tonight's discussion is really about how do we create opportunities for everyone? How do we create communities that work for everyone? And I'm excited to be here tonight. One thing I always like to note as well is that we are very lucky, all of us right now. We are in our homes and we are safe and sound. And so just a note of gratitude for all of the people out and about who are keeping our state running, who are frontline workers, our transit drivers, our farm workers. So thankful for all of them for the work that they do. The country is now officially in recession, triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the virus now more under control, we're starting to shift our thoughts to how we can safely reopen the state and reinvigorate the economy. And we have to think long-term. So as we think about growing the economy, I like to think about smart growth. And will we grow our state in a way that adds values to communities and neighborhoods, in a way that promotes clean air, clean water? Will we grow in a way that's sustainable in an era of climate change? And how we answer those questions, questions that also, will we grow in a way that address historic inequities in housing and access to amenities? So how we answer all of these questions really depends in part on our willingness to look back where we came from in our structures, using our historic structures themselves as the backbone for future growth. I live right now, and where I'm sitting is in Fells Point, which is one of the state's most historic neighborhoods. It's a network of short blocks and variably sized row homes, corner shops, and active park space, and it's eminently livable. The one major downside, I will say, is a lack of transit, but we're working on it. Building off of neighborhoods like Fells Point is an important part of rebuilding our state and making room for growth. And historic preservation and revitalization, that was the original smart growth movement, and we have to go back to that and have to make sure that we're keeping that in mind. So to discuss smart growth and the amazing resources that we have in the form of historic structures in Maryland today, I am really excited to have a phenomenal group of preservationists and developers and thinkers about all of this work. We're going to start with Donovan today. Donovan Rickema is a principal of Place Economics, a Washington, D.C. based real estate and economic development consulting firm. The work of his firm is at the nexus of historic preservation and economics. He's undertaken assignments for public and nonprofit sector clients in 49 states. So I can't wait to hear the state that you're missing. Maybe we can figure out how to get you there at some point. So I'm going to turn it over to him. I'm excited to hear his presentation. And then we're going to Nick, I'll turn it over to you and we'll talk, and Nikita and John as well. So looking forward to this. And Donovan, I'm going to advance your slides now so you can take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Delegate Lehrman. I'm most pleased to be here tonight. You can go to the next one. About the time the plague hit us all, we had finished a month or two ahead of that a study in the city of San Antonio, looking at their older housing stock, by which we just defined as pre-1960. But whether or not it was designated historic, we looked at the role of the older housing stock as part of the response to the affordable housing crisis. And then comes the plague, and then comes the giant $2 trillion federal appropriation. Next, please. And I certainly have no quarrel with what Congress did at the president signed. It was critical, and the world was going to hell, and the economy was rapidly shrinking, and so was they had to do it, and $2 trillion worth. But I just want to have you all keep in mind, 100% of that was borrowed money, and 100% of it was short-term impacts. The $1,200 each of us got that we've already spent short-term. And the fact is that I have two grandchildren, 8 and 10. They won't even be in the workforce for another 10 or 15 years, but they will spend their entire working life paying off this debt that we incurred over a weekend 2 months ago. Next, please. Well, one way or another, there's another round that's going to be coming. And I think that it ought to be based not on the urgency of the moment, but on some kind of long-term economic, social, and fiscal principles. Next, please. So we wrote this document, and we're not in the political business. We're preservation economists, but based on what we've done and the lessons we've learned, we suggest that there's some principles for what this next stimulus bill will be. First of all, if we're going to spend that much money, it ought to be in long-term assets. It ought to be job creating. It ought to have benefits to local economies. Local governments ought to be assisted. It needs to be environmentally responsible. It ought to be as part of a comprehensive resiliency strategy. And we ought to look for ways where every dollar that money is spent responds to more than just one need. And finally, there ought to be an administrative framework to implement whatever Congress passes. Next, please. So the other economic crisis, we've had this pandemic spurred crisis of the last 2 months, but there has been an economic crisis building for more than a decade, and that's the crisis in affordable housing. That yes. We cost burdened households are defined as those who spend more than 30% of their household income on housing. Well, that's 20 million rental households in America, 17 million homeowner households. In fact, 31% of all households and almost half of all rental households fall into this cost-burdened category. And we have a federal program that responds to affordable housing, the low-income housing tax credit, but it generates 100,000 units a year. Next, please. So we'd like to make the case that the rehabilitation of older housing stock, whether or not it's on somebody's historic list, ought to be a priority element of the next stimulus plan. Next. So in our work in doing the study in San Antonio, we took a good look at the housing stock nationwide. And again, I don't care if you decide holding is before 1970 or 1950 or whatever, we picked 1960, but here's true of that housing stock. About 29% of all housing stock in America is that pre-1960 period, but 33% of all households that make less than $15,000 a year, so the bottom of the thing, live in that older housing. 45% of all housing units is still rent for less than $1,000 a month, were built before 1960, and 32% of all both Hispanic families and African-American families, in fact, live in pre-1960 housing. Next. But there's three premises that we kind of did our analysis on and write this paper on, and they are these. Number one, you cannot build new and rent cheap. Can't be done unless you have extraordinarily deep subsidies. Second, almost by definition, every time a unit of older housing is raised, a unit of affordable housing is lost. And third, while there's some existing programs, they really need to be realigned to prioritize maintaining existing housing. Next. And here's the frightening part. Every year that low-income housing tax credit creates 100,000 or so units, every year we lose 200,000 pre-1960 housing units. So there's no way to catch up with that. No way to keep tearing down what we're tearing down, which is affordable, and building in many cases, which is not. Next. The median cost of a low-income housing tax credit project unit over the country over the last 10 or 12 years, $165,000 a unit. Now, I don't quarrel with what building costs are, but the vast majority of the houses that were torn down could have been rehabilitated, put in habitable shape, far less than $165,000. Next.
Yeah.
A great study was done by a NGO here, a nonprofit organization here in Washington, and they looked at 2,500 projects over the last decade that used the low-income housing tax credit, the average cost per unit. Well, the new construction units, about 210,000 a unit, acquisition and rehab, $50,000 less. So even if you're the side of the political spectrum to say we got to be frugal with taxpayers' dollars, we ought to be doing way more rehabilitating as compared to new construction next. And you know, we'll hear people say, well, that old stuff, it's all fallen down. We just can't, it's not worth saving. It's just factually incorrect that in the US Census of Housing that's conducted periodically, while 1.8% of occupied housing is seen as seriously inadequate, and another about 6% moderately inadequate, 93% of it is not in that category. Now, maybe we have to lose that 6% in those inadequate, but that's not the case. Having said that, there are some things that are needed to make those houses really fully livable. That 8% of the pre-1960 housing has heating issues, some have leaks, some have roof repairs, some have electrical problems, but those are all remediable at relatively modest costs. Next. In Baltimore, by the way, and we move from the issue of we need housing, we also need people to have jobs. And beyond the restaurant and the hotel business, the construction industry has been most severely affected by this pandemic. Well, in Baltimore, when you spend $1 million rehabilitating, that creates 5.7 jobs in Baltimore, and another 2.8 indirect jobs in Baltimore, with paychecks of $400,000 and $172,000 respectively. Next. And nationally, when you look at the national numbers, that when $1 million is spent in new construction, that creates 100. Every time 100 jobs is created in new construction, another 135 are created elsewhere in the economy. But when you create 100 jobs in rehabilitation, 186 jobs elsewhere are created in the economy. That has to do with labor intensity, the localization, labor versus materials, and those translate into paychecks. So every $100 of labor income in new construction means $145 for other people in the economy, but $100 in labor income and rehabilitation means other people are getting $174 in paychecks. Next. And it's this extraordinary local impact of preservation. Every time you spend $1 million on rehabilitation, 83,000 more will be spent locally in the local, plumbing operation, in the hardware store and elsewhere locally, than if you spent the same amount in new construction. Next. And then on the environmental side, and many of you have heard our friend Carl Elefante, the immediate past president of the AIA, talk about being the greenest building is the one that's already there. Well, that has to do with the embodied energy already in that building. It has to do with the impact on the landfill that's increasingly expensive, both in dollars and environmental quality, and all the green gizmos people are talking about, but it takes 10 to 80 years to recover the energy that was used just to make them the gizmos to put in the green gizmo house. This issue of labor intensive, and then this issue that labor is local, materials are not. So rehabilitation has a much stronger impact locally. Next. So some kind of general conclusions. Number one, this issue of housing affordability, it's not a joke. It's not somebody's political platform. It's real and it's serious and it's going to get worse. And much of the affordable housing that's provided, not without subsidies or grants or loan, anything, just because it still sits in the marketplace. A huge share of affordable housing provided by the marketplace is older housing, but we're losing that housing at a very rapid pace. Next, please. Now, we can't do it all with rehabilitation. Certainly, new construction has to be a part of responding to the affordable housing issue, but that's not going to be cheap, and it's not by itself going to be sufficient. And so as much as possible of the existing older housing stock, we got to figure out ways to keep it. Next. So our recommendations, again, from non-political people to what ought to be in the next stimulus bill really is 4 pieces. Number one, needs to provide funds to local governments so they can invest in their older housing stock, owner-occupied, rental-occupied, whatever, make it to fix that roof and fix that leak. For years, there was proposed to Congress historic homeowners tax credit. It would apply to the homeowner like the commercial historic tax credit does. We think that ought to be reconsidered. Expand the federal tax credit for smaller projects, and then create a job training program for the rehabilitation trades. Next. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. Fascinating stuff, really interesting. And now I'm really pleased to welcome, I'm going to stop the share for a minute and turn it over to Nicholas Redding. Nicholas Redding is the Executive Director of Preservation Maryland, one of the nation's oldest statewide preservation groups. Prior to joining the organization in 2014, he served in leadership capacities at several preservation and heritage nonprofits. He's a graduate of Shepherd University and lives with his wife, daughter, and 2 beagles in Frederick, or near Frederick. And we're delighted. He's anybody who's been in Annapolis knows that he's a fierce advocate in Annapolis for Preservation Maryland, for historic tax credit work, for revitalization and preservation. So really excited to have him here. Nicholas, I'm going to turn it over to you. Now, are you going to introduce John, or?
Yeah, so I'll do a quick intro for them.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that, Brooke. And if with any luck, the beagles will be quiet during this presentation. You know, it's fantastic to hear the real detail, the nitty gritty of why this work that we do is so important from Donovan. You know, the numbers are just so overwhelming when it comes to why we should be investing in this. Which I will say, you know, for everybody who's tuned into this call, you know, Delegate Lehrman talked about the role she plays as a delegate and the way that she sees that, you know, taking place. And she's done fantastic work for us and for the broader preservation community. And we've accomplished some really good things. And we've been making the case for this kind of work and why saving historic places, revitalizing places, matters, and not just matters from a sense of saving our history, which we didn't even really touch on. And in times like these, where we're trying to bring up and sort of uplift underrepresented stories and voices, saving that history is critically important. So there's a big role to play there. But obviously, from the dollars and cents of it, it makes a lot of sense to invest in these places. So we've had some success, and I want to mention a success, a challenge, and an opportunity for people on this call to sort of think about when it comes to this work, and then sort of hand it over to 2 great leaders in the field of preservation who are engaged in doing this and seeing these projects through. One of the successes we've had that we actually worked with Delegate Lehrman on was amending our state historic tax credit, which, you know, Delegate Lehrman mentioned sort of just in passing here a second ago about the state historic tax credit, the work we've done on it. That's really where the rubber hits the road here in Maryland and how we can invest in these places. You know, there's federal policy, then there's our state policy. And one of the successes we've had in recent years with the state historic, the revitalization tax credit, is putting in a 5% bump for affordable housing. So we have been very purposeful about making sure that there is a role for this tax credit to play and for preservation and revitalization to play when it comes to affordable housing. So there is a percentage bump. So that's a good thing because it really can be used for that now. And now the affordable housing advocates have taken notice of this credit and the value of it. One of the challenges that we continue to face in Maryland, and you know, we're approaching a session that is going to be, everything is unparalleled now, right? But we're really going to be in an unparalleled session when it comes to the pressure being put on the state budget and from every direction. Unfortunately, our historic tax credit, our revitalization tax credit here in Maryland, has been underfunded for years. It currently operates at a $9 million appropriation. To put that in context, the Commonwealth of Virginia appropriates at least, they actually have an uncapped program, but they do about $100 million a year in state historic tax credits. And then if you take Massachusetts and Wisconsin, which population-wise and state budget-wise are good parallels to Maryland, they're doing about $50 million a year. So we're not even in the same ballpark. And when you look at the size of these credits at $3 million potentially per credit, you're talking about 3 projects a year. Well, you know, Donovan just mentioned that we need, hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing here in here in Maryland. We need thousands of units of affordable housing. We will never get there building new, and it needs to be a mix, but we certainly don't have the resources in place. So when it comes to there being a challenge, the challenge of funding for this program and competing for resources, but we really do see it as something that deserves support and awareness and attention. The other opportunity that I would mention too, and something that we as an organization have been investing in, is trades as a component of all of this. So we've talked about affordable housing, we've talked about the environmental impact, but there's careers to be made out of turning young adults, recent veterans in our case, into people who can actually do this work. Because there's a lot of very fine, detailed trades work associated with restoring historic places. And so we've actually launched something called the Campaign for Historic Trades, and are working with the National Park Service and a unit of the Park Service based in Frederick, Maryland, to actually put apprentices in the field. We had almost 60 apprentices in the field last year. That program has slowed down a little bit because of the pandemic, but we intend on really reinvesting in that over the coming years and trying to grow that, because we see that as a huge potential for jobs. So not only can we restore a place, but we can engage people in that process. As I mentioned, I'm pleased to be able to hand it over to two folks here who are going to talk and speak from experience when it comes to doing this work and are actually part of the industry that makes all of this happen. So John Renner is with Cross Street Partners. So he is a developer, but we won't hold that against him tonight. And he's a good one. And John works really at the intersection of community development, revitalization, affordable housing, and sort of building place. And then we also have Nikita Reed, who is a fantastic preservation architect, who herself works at the intersection of environmental sustainability and preservation in a way that I've never met anyone who can speak with such authority on it. And I'm also very pleased to say she's a member of our board, as is John. And so Nikita is going to talk from the side of how design can really help communities. It's not just about the dollars and cents of it, but it's about converting a vacant building into something that's usable and is a community resource rather than a community eyesore, and the work that she does around that. So I'm happy to hand it over, and I think we're going to John. Is that right, Brooke?
Yep, I think so.
Cool.
John, so great to have you on. I'm going to share the screen so we can do your slides. Here we go.
Thanks for the introduction, Nick, and thank you, Delegate, for having
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
this evening. I'll start by saying, and maybe Nick can do the earmuffs thing, that I didn't get into preservation development for the sake of preservation. Thanks to some good professors in college, my interest has always been community development, and I'm happy that Nick used those words to describe the type of work that Cross Street Partners does. I've come to find the preservation aspect fascinating, but it's really community development. And I lived a bunch of different places and did a bunch of different things with my career, and came back to Baltimore in my early 30s and gravitated towards preservation development because it seemed that most of the large-scale neighborhood revitalizations that have occurred in Baltimore City are anchored by some form of adaptive reuse, historic preservation project, or several of them. And our objective as a company is that large-scale neighborhood transformation, and trying to find a way to create positive community change while limiting kind of the negative aspects of gentrification.
Right.
So I'm going to breeze through some pictures of projects that we've either done or are embarking upon. And I'm a little obsessed by the go back in time feature on Google Maps. So I included before pictures of each of these projects. I have my own pictures, but I just get a kick out of Google Maps. So this is the Lyon Brothers building. It's located at the intersection of the Hollins Market neighborhood in Southwest Baltimore and the University of Maryland Biopark. We decided to do Line Brothers as our first project because we were totally inspired by the planning efforts of the Southwest Partnership. It was 6 neighborhoods
Yeah.
banded together to speak with a common voice. And the biopark itself created an economic rationale for the redevelopment of this building that we could pitch to lenders and investors. And we ended up with a really cool mix of tenants. Just about everything's in this building: food production, soon to be some retail. There's art studios, there's a business incubator, and affordable housing developer has office space here, as well as a CDFI lender. We can go to the next one, Brooke. Okay, so the Hohen Lithograph building, this one is very near and dear to my heart. This is a 85,000 square foot building that's located in what historically was known as the Middle East neighborhood. Some call it Collington Square. It's about 6 blocks north of Johns Hopkins Hospital and just north of what's now EBDI. The anchor tenants here are Strong City Baltimore, a community organizer, an adult literacy center, and Associated Builders and Contractors' new Construction Academy of Baltimore, which is a really exciting, huge expansion of construction workforce training, moving from Towson into Baltimore City, into East Baltimore, which is cool. Financing and leasing this building was hands down the most challenging thing I've ever attempted in my professional career.
Yeah.
And we finally got it underway. And what the coolest part about the project actually is something that we didn't even do. The blight elimination in the area around Hohen has just totally accelerated since we started construction. And it's all small developers, small contractors doing a few row homes at a time as workforce housing or affordable housing. And one of the affordable housing developers told us that he settled on the acquisition of like a dozen row homes the day after we were awarded state historic tax credits for this project.
Wow.
You know that it would still take us another year to get it financed, but
Right.
it all worked out in the end for everyone.
That's very cool.
Yeah, we can go to the next one. Hebrew Orphans Asylum. So this is jumping over to the Mosher, little known Mosher neighborhood of West Baltimore. This is a beautiful building that was once an orphanage. Some people call it the American Brewery of the West because it has that same
Pretty spectacular.
magnificent architecture. The anchor tenant here is a stabilization center, which is a place where first responders can take people found on the street with an opioid issue, as opposed to taking them to jail or the emergency room, which obviously both of which have huge social costs, economic costs. And that it feels a little like a drug treatment center, although it's something completely different. And one of the things we did with this project, and I should mention, we undertook it in partnership with the Coppin Heights CDC. One of the things we did was sponsor a trip to San Francisco so that the community could see a stabilization center in operation there. And the community ultimately got behind this use for the building. And this is not a rendering, this is a picture. It has that kind of hyper-real quality of a rendering, but the building's done and soon to be occupied. We can go to the next one. So we're doing our first row home renovation project. This is, it's a project called Henderson Crossing. It's just a few blocks south of the Hohen Lithograph building in East Baltimore. I have a fantasy. They say that in Hohen, it was common for several generations of one family to work at Hohen and live in the neighborhood. And I have a fantasy that some workers at Hohen lived in these houses that we're renovating a few blocks south, and it's probably the case. About 20% of the units in this project are affordable. We're just getting started, as you can see here, taking the form stone off the properties and repointing the brick. And I think the first house will be occupied next month. I mean, someday they'll call the form stone historic, but for now, we've got to.
For now, we're taking it off.
Yeah.
And this is right across the street from Henderson Hopkins, correct?
Yes, this picture is taken from the beautiful Henderson Hopkins School.
Yep. And for those who don't know, that is a charter school in Baltimore.
And this is the last project I'll mention. Many of you will recognize the building in the foreground as Baltimore Penn Station. And what you see in the background is just an artist's rendering at this point of what some new development could look like around Penn Station. So the historic preservation and adaptive reuse of the existing station is just an anchor for a larger mixed-use transit-oriented development that we're doing in partnership with BD Development and Amtrak. Not everyone knows that the historic station has 3 vacant upper levels. The majority of the building is vacant and has been for 20 or 30 years. It's only the main concourse level and a little bit of the basement that's occupied by Amtrak and MARC. This is a really interesting one and challenging one for me and for the development team. This part of central Baltimore has been gentrifying, and a question is, how do we undertake this project in a way that doesn't exacerbate that? And Penn Station is different from Canton, or from doing the Can Company in Canton as an example, because gentrification in this part of town has a racial, ethnic component as well as a socioeconomic component, which distinguishes it from some of the other areas of Baltimore that have revitalized. So it brings up a lot of good questions. I can't say we have all the answers at this point, but my hope is that we deliver something that has enough benefits for the community that those benefits outweigh whatever impact this project has on property values in the area.
Yeah.
So that's all for the projects. I guess Nick talked about this, but the last thing I'll say, the unifying feature of all these projects is that their economics totally rely on the state historic tax credit. And like Nick said, it's woefully underfunded, both for small projects like Henderson Crossing, which use the small commercial program, and then the rest use the large commercial program. And I believe, Delegate, you were involved with a fix to the state historic tax credit for the row home projects, which is fantastic and making our project work. But 9 million just isn't enough. A lot of developers don't mess with historic preservation because the chances of getting the thing that's essential to being successful with your project are so small.
Yep. Yeah, no, it is a huge problem. Well, thank you. Thanks so much, John. This is great. It's exciting to see all the work that you've done, and really excited about the Penn Station work as well. Scroll through. So now I'm thrilled to have Nikita join us to talk a little bit about the work that she and her team have done, and how they do it and why they do it. So I'm going to turn it over to you and have
Great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you for having us and putting this together. I'm very grateful to be here to talk about a lot of these projects. So I am a preservation architect. So I focus more so at the scale of the building. And so most of the community revitalization that happens is going to happen building by building as properties continue to be financed and developed by various developers. And so as you may or may not recognize, this is a shot of Clipper Mill and Woodbury Kitchen. And so I'm going to go ahead and talk through a couple of the other projects that we've done. Yeah, I can go to the next slide. And so Quinn Evans, is there more? Can you hit next? There's some images that are missing. Okay, well, that's all right. So there, if you go back one then, so Quinn Evans is actually the legacy Chobin Holbeck firm, which is a name that may be more familiar to many people in Baltimore. But there have been a number of studies done by various organizations to look at the impacts of vacant properties and abandoned properties in neighborhoods. We know that these historic buildings don't exist in a vacuum, and there is an impact that vacant and abandoned properties have on community members and those who live in the building or in the community. Unfortunately, the images aren't showing, but there were images of vacant buildings around Baltimore. We'll just see them in the after. But one of the things I did want to mention about this when we're in the neighborhood doing community engagement, as we're looking at the different buildings that we're working on, we found that there's often an us versus them mentality that a lot of residents will voice because of the frustration they feel of developers or building owners who let their buildings sit vacant. So it becomes a they don't care about us because they're letting
Right.
their buildings sit vacant. And so
Right.
really dealing with the existing buildings and the vacant buildings, because people don't want to live around buildings that can invite unsavory activities and dangerous activities and things that can also just lead to more stress and depression and etc. So we really like to focus on revitalizing the buildings to help with the community revitalization. So you can go to the next one. And so as Nick and John and Donovan have also alluded to, preservation trades are huge and a big economic driver when it comes to preservation, because these are jobs that can't be outsourced, they can't be digitized. So things from window repairs, construction, mortar replacement, all of those items are local. And then also there's an issue in the preservation trades currently where a lot of the tradesmen and women are starting to age out. And so there's this concern that at some point in time, there may not be enough trained practitioners to do the work that needs to be done on these existing and historic buildings. So as Nick mentioned, Preservation Maryland now has a partnership with the NCPTT with the National Park Service out of Frederick. And the Preservation Maryland partnership is new with the training center, but the training center itself has been doing these kind of trades programs for more than a decade. There's also Hope Crew, which stands for Hands-On Preservation Experience, and that's a program that's administered by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, also to get more people that aren't the typical older white males into the preservation trades profession. So that it's really been a focus on getting more younger minorities, veterans, et cetera, into the preservation trades program. Next slide. Yeah, it's a really great program. So unfortunately, we'll work through it. It's fine. So this is
Did it get all messed up?
It
Sorry.
did. No worries. We're gonna work through it. It's all right.
Quick. Well, I can bring up your
Okay.
up your original one. Hold on one
Yeah,
second.
that'd be great.
I'll find it.
Cool. So I just want to go through and talk through a couple of the transformative projects that the firm has done in Baltimore that have really had an impact on the area. And so I just joined the firm in September. So none of these are projects that I worked on directly, but these are projects that brought me to the firm because I was excited to see the kind of work that the firm has done and the legacy that they've really built around Baltimore. You'll notice that there will be some that John already referenced, since Quinn Evans and Cross Street Partners have had a lot of working experience and a lot of working relationship. So we'll forgive the redundancy a little bit. Oh, there we go. Okay. So these are just some of the before shots of some properties around Baltimore. So it's Everyman Theater on the far left, and then Clipper Mill before in the middle, American Brewery third over, and then these are some typical row houses on Harlem Avenue. All right, so we can skip and one more. All right, great. So this is the Lion Brothers building, as John mentioned. And this was originally built as a livery stable in 1885, and it was vacant for a number of years before the project got revitalized. And so with this one, there were a number of challenges from a design standpoint, but ultimately the design team was able to create a cohesive floor plan around a central stair, and also do some really cool things with steel-clad fire doors and vibrant graphics throughout the building, which really brought this building back to life. And you can see some of the interiors on the bottom right.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. Next one. So OpenWorks, this one isn't exactly a historic building, but this is one of the buildings that was a typical existing warehouse building over in the Oliver neighborhood. And as Donovan mentioned, we're looking at all existing buildings, not just the ones that are considered historic. But this one also had such a fantastic community revitalization aspect to it that I wanted to make sure to include it. So this became a maker space, and there was also a farmer's market that's held here in the community. And so the OpenWorks welcomes local artists and craftspeople to support their small scale manufacturing startups. So basically it's a way and a space for makers to come and create their craft and be able to rent stalls or use tools without having to buy all the tools that they would need on their own.
Very cool.
Yeah, we can go to the next one. Everyman Theater, this is another one which may be familiar to many people on the call. So the Everyman Theater had outgrown their space, and so they acquired the vacant town theater to expand for their group. And so it's a 250-seat theater within a theater that was reinserted into the building shell. So it's a really great reuse of the space and a way to show that the existing building can be revitalized and changed and redesigned in a way that can support a new use. Often there is a misconception that historic buildings have to remain exactly as they were, but really that's not the case. Historic buildings can be reused to become things that are helpful for the current and the existing people who are alive, not just celebrating the people who are no longer here. And so there are a number of architectural details and graphics that also educate the public as they're coming in. And then there's 2 entrances into the building from 2 different streets. So that way it's able to get more eyes on the street and make this street more vibrant. So it's less of the dangerous feeling of walking past a vacant building that's all boarded up. So it really enlivens the street.
Very cool.
And next one. So this one is one that's at MICA. And so it transformed the historic warehouse into a dynamic hub for graduate art students. And it's really a showpiece for the downtown neighborhood. It was a underutilized building, and then it got renovated in a couple different construction phases. But it's one of those really interesting spaces that improves the street presence and then also gets more eyes on the street. A lot of times when people are driving through cities, they feel unsafe when they see the state of the building stock. They see the broken windows, deferred maintenance. That's more so what makes someone feel unsafe in an area, as opposed to seeing any sort of acts of violence. It's often there's no people on the street because the building has deferred maintenance and there's other concerns of being in that public space. And then let's go one more. And so John mentioned that the former orphanage building was the American Brewery of the East or West, and so this is the actual American Brewery he was referring to. So this one it's turned into offices, and it's now the headquarters for the Humana nonprofit organization. And it is a former brewery, so it was built in 1887, and it housed the American Brewery until 1973, and then it was vacant for a long time. There's been a number of other kind of revitalization efforts that have happened in the Oliver area and the Oliver neighborhood after this project happened. But this is the kind of anchor project for an area that can really start to transform the area surrounding it. Because as John mentioned, for the Hohen building, once one project starts and people start to see investment coming back to the building or coming back to the area, then other developers start to look at how they can also get in and revitalize the area. And gentrification is a very something that is often associated with preservation, sometimes incorrectly, but it is a real concern to make sure that the people who have stayed in an area as the area was disinvested in and transitioned, make sure that they're not placed out. So it's making sure that the residents who have lived in the area and made the area important can still benefit from the positive changes that come from the revitalization of the area. And the last thing I'll mention is just that preservation is also an inherently sustainable pursuit. As Donovan mentioned, that Carl said, is that the greenest building is the one that's often already built. And the amount of preservation and revitalization, the reuse of the existing building materials that prevents materials from going to the landfill is an inherently sustainable pursuit. So I think that's my last one, and I will turn it back to you, Brooke.
Great, thank you. Well, now we're going to turn to some questions. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And then we're also going to go over some of the questions that were mailed in. And all of the panelists are welcome to weigh in. I'm not going to dictate who gets what, but I will read through some of these questions that were submitted and would love to hear your feedback. And again, folks, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them. So one question was about enterprise zone tax incentives and whether enterprise zone tax incentives are helpful in the preservation of historic properties or older properties. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Well, I guess it's kind of in my area. We haven't actually worked with enterprise zones, and different states and different cities have created their own with kind of different criteria, so I can't answer. I think the one that, however, that's on the horizon, and who knows if its promise will be fulfilled, is the opportunity zones that are frequently overlap with historic districts or collections of historic buildings. And a lot of money is being raised for investment in opportunity zones. And if it's not screwed up along the way, I think it could have a major impact on center city heritage buildings.
That's interesting. Yeah, of course, a lot of people have been talking about opportunity zones. John or Nikita, have your companies been able to utilize those at all for financing, or still looking into the opportunity zone project, or what have you experienced?
I guess with enterprise zone credits, I'll just quickly say the property tax credit programs are essential, like enterprise zones, and the property, both enterprise zone property tax credits as well as brownfields. But with opportunity zones, we were fortunate with Baltimore Penn Station before COVID to close with Blueprint Local, an opportunity zone fund investor that's affiliated with Brown Advisory. And they're like the real deal in terms of looking for social impact with their projects.
Good question. So a question here that I do think is interesting. Why is it that in inner parts of cities in predominantly Black communities, they demolish or preserve what appears to be they demolish or preserve older homes, but in areas that are mostly white, they preserve them and then sell them, i.e. like a Federal Hill or Fells Point versus, in East Baltimore. Why does the city use eminent domain to take this land? And what can we do? I'd say a follow-up is, what can we do to help make sure that we are preserving homes for future use in all neighborhoods? Any thoughts on that? I know.
So, I mean, go ahead, Nikita, you start.
So, I mean, that's a layered question, but at the heart of it, it's, I'm trying to be PC on this, but also just policies that haven't always had the best interest of the residents in mind. Also, it's a lot of times there's more of a discrepancy between lower income Black residents not owning the homes versus the homeowners of white residents in more older homes that typically get after more of the preservation protections, if you will. I have some thoughts on why. I'm sure everyone has some thoughts on systemic racism and how that's played into this. And so hopefully going forward, that will continue to improve and systemic racism will continue to be eradicated, but it's just, we're not there yet. And historically that's been an issue.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I would also add that, as like a very specific policy example is that like we're working in Hagerstown, for example, and Preservation Maryland has a property redevelopment program now of our own, and we're about to close on a historic building and are going to be rehabbing it and then selling it for owner-occupied affordable housing. It's a small catalytic project. It's like an 800 square foot home. So it's small, but it's a small neighborhood. But the challenge there, it's a traditionally African-American neighborhood. And unlike the rest of the area, which is under a local historic designation, which protects against demolition and can kind of guide rehab, sort of like a Federal Hill or a Fells Point or something like that. It is not. It was cut out. And so it was missing those protections. And so that neighborhood looks very different than the neighborhood a couple streets over that had local designations. Both on the National Register, one protected with local designation, one not. And so that is a, to Nikita's point about systemic racism and policy decisions made about place, it's very clear what happened there. Now I will say that the city of Hagerstown is very interested and very supportive of this project and trying to reinvest in this community, but it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time to turn back decades worth of bad decisions like that.
Yeah. that is a really interesting distinction because, of course, I mean, in Fells Point and Federal Hill, they worked very hard to get their designations, and they are CHAP districts and they are so protected. And of course, yeah, I'm sure, like, I would be shocked if somebody told me that, like, Oliver or some neighborhood just north, you know, even a Highland town, you know, they don't have these types of protections. So that
Right,
is,
and I think Donovan probably could give you numbers off the top of his head about the value of homes inside of a historic district versus outside, but I know that those numbers are normally pretty stark.
Well, they are, and what's interesting is that what's more more dramatic than simply the difference in values of properties in or not in historic districts is two things really important, including for minority neighborhoods, is that the rate of appreciation, whether it's from a low end or a high end, doesn't matter. The rate of appreciation in local historic districts significantly outperforms the market as a whole. And when, for all of us, black or white, most of our worth comes from home ownership, that
right.
this issue, while it has some negative consequences, in fact, as property values go up, that's wealth building for individuals. But the second thing that I think is really maybe more important, in the last Great Recession, we've now looked at 30 cities or more, is that the foreclosure rates in local historic districts averaged half of what it did in the city as a whole, half. And it was, and it didn't have anything to do with the wealth of the neighborhoods. That was true in rich neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, everything in between. Well, somebody ought to be paying attention. HUD, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the ABA, people ought to be paying attention. Huge difference. And I think the reason is really driven by two things. It's not that people who live in historic neighborhoods never get divorced or get fired or run their credit cards up too much. It is that if I get in financial trouble, that even in down markets, there's a strong enough latent demand for properties that I can get that property sold before I get to the foreclosure stage. Somebody should be paying attention, because one of the outcomes when you have this many people out of work for an extended period of time, we're going to see foreclosures jumping.
Yeah.
And we ought to say where are those happening and what tools lessen that.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. That is a fascinating statistic. Wow. So question in the chat: how can we encourage developers to invest in low-income communities with a great supply of historic housing stock that's sometimes perceived as more of a liability than an asset? What does it take? I mean, John, this is what you guys do, and Nikita, you as well. But I'm curious, is it all about the money? Is it, how can we make sure that we are pushing this for, making sure that it's possible for you to do those row homes across from Henderson Hopkins and in other areas?
Yeah, I really worry about this because with Henderson Crossing, while the neighborhood has its challenges, our project is in EBDI. There's a strong
There's already a lot of development happening there. Yeah.
In the Mosher neighborhood around Hebrew Orphan Asylum. And I think about it in the context of really understanding now the economics of the row home business. It's a huge mountain to climb to make these types of projects financially feasible. And the small commercial tax credit program is part of the equation. The DHCD programs like CORE and Bernie, keeping those well funded is essential. And then at the local level, having kind of and I think we had this to some extent, but having Baltimore Housing participate as a real partner, giving homes to developers for $1, for example, the city can contribute without losing money out of their pocket.
Yeah, and I'd second all of those, because one of the struggles, particularly in Baltimore, is that the Baltimore housing market isn't the same as the DC housing market. So while it may cost about the same to do the renovation, you're not going to be able to sell the property for enough to make the numbers make sense in some cases. So all of the different tax credits and subsidies are really important to make the building make sense from a financial standpoint as well.
Well, and I know sorry, Brooke, but because we're with Delegate Lehrman, we're talking a lot about Baltimore City. But to your point, Nikita, about the housing market differences, then go to Cambridge, then go to Frostburg.
And it's even,
even more pronounced. And so the challenges of rural Maryland, which are critically important to us, I mean, we have to care about everything,
Yeah.
is, you know, it is even more profound there. And so there you need that subsidy, you know, even greater. And I will say it's not all about the government spending money. I mean, obviously they have to spend money, but they actually make money on this program. The state of
Sure.
Maryland
Of course they
makes
do.
money on this
Yeah.
program. And I don't know if we've said that, but there are tax credits out there. In theory, they all should at some point make money for the state, but this one makes it a lot faster. And for every dollar the state puts in, we've had 3 studies now confirm this, all from different firms, because the state gets back about $8 for every dollar invested. And that normally happens by between year 4 and 6 of the project. That's pretty quick, and that's a really great return. It's just that the state, and we worked really closely this past session with Senator Katie Fry Hester in Howard County, and we just sort of beat our head against the wall because the state budget's year by year. So the state doesn't look out and say, well, what's going to happen 10 years from now? We're going to make so much more money. We should look at it in that long term. And having that long-term visioning is something we need.
That is a very good point. Yes, death to short-termism. So I think this is that's a good segue to the small commercial credit question. And we're just going to take 1 or 2 more questions and then wrap it up. But there's a question about, you know, that the small commercial credit had a $4 million allocation a couple years ago, and it is almost all used up. It will then no longer be available. Is there an effort to fund it again? And I think this goes to the larger question of funding for the historic revitalization tax credit generally. And, you know, really Preservation Maryland has been at the forefront, but there are so many other groups. And I had somebody in the chat also mentioned League of Conservation Voters, like they should be increasing their efforts for preservation and sustainably built environment. All the, you know, affordable housing developers, all, you know, it almost feels like a coalition has formed or could be formed to really just push, you know, lobby on some of these issues and make sure we all know about it. But I'm curious, you know, your thoughts on how we make this happen.
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said, I don't disagree with any of it. And, you know, as you know, here in Maryland, we have a very strong executive branch when it comes to the budget, and that budget originates there. And things can be done, but it is challenging. And this is in the operating capital because of where it falls, which makes it a little bit more challenging than like a bonded capital. So yes to all of those things about the coalition. We've been trying over the past several years and definitely intend on making a push. And next year is going to be a tough year to push for more money. But at the same time, if we're looking at ways of investing and recovery to that point that Donovan started this conversation about, then we have to have really serious conversations about tax credits, for example, and which tax credit programs are we going to invest in? And those are all like, everybody's got their own special little interest. And some tax credits cost, and there's tax credits out there that cost about $1 million per job. Those are like insane. And I think that if we're looking at profound societal value, even if you just look at affordable housing and environmental value, this is one where we need that support. So, you know, delighted to work with League of Conservation Voters. We have in the past. Kristen Harbison is a force unto herself. And I'm sure we will work with them again. But anybody who wants to work with us, we are willing to partner with anyone, and would love to be able to work again with Delegate Learman in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have, there's one good question here that I thought might be good for folks to use as a sort of final last word. So it stated, what barrier or barriers would you remove to incentivize historic revitalization and the development of more affordable housing around the state of Maryland? So of course, there's the funding barrier, but if there are other barriers in Baltimore or elsewhere, I think, you know, would love to hear your final thoughts before we sign off tonight. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Who's going to take it first, Donovan, or do you have one ready to go?
Donovan, you want to start us off?
Well, I will, although, you know, I live in the district, and so I know less about everything's happening in the state to the north. But I think, and all preservationists are not going to like hearing this, but I think we need to step back and think about our design review requirements and what we're requiring. It just doesn't make sense to me that we have the same set of standards for 18-foot wide row house in Baltimore as we do with, and again, I'm not talking about the Baltimore Preservation
Yep.
Commission that I think is a great one. I just mean conceptually
Yep.
that we need to think about design standards appropriate to the neighborhood, appropriate to the building typology. Now, I do not believe that we ought to have different standards for poor neighborhoods than rich ones. Poor people have been stuck with second best too long, but we ought to have standards that apply to the building typology. And I think in many cases that could be much more modest than they are.
Thank you. Great thought and good comments. Thank you. John?
I'll just mention one thing I mentioned before. A lot of our projects and the projects we're looking at getting involved in now are city owned, and oftentimes the city is looking for a market acquisition price for the building, and just trying to pay that market value for the property and cobble together 35 different funding sources for a $20 million project is too much. And I think it's kind of penny wise, pound foolish for the city to insist on, and other places in Maryland to insist on, an upfront acquisition price when they know renovating the building will result in a building getting added to the tax roll.
Right. Thanks. Nikita?
Yeah, I'm going to second Donovan on some of the design guidelines. One of the things that is starting to shift in preservation a little bit is the recognition that typically preservation has focused very heavily on material integrity and architectural value, and less on the cultural value of the buildings. And so really reevaluating how we're determining the historic value of buildings that may not be beautifully architecturally, but they still have a cultural importance from a preservation standpoint, and how we actually get those into the tax credit as well. So we're not just overvaluing architectural integrity of the buildings.
Well, I think MHT is on this call, so
Yeah, hi
talking to
Elizabeth.
the right people.
Yeah.
And Nicholas.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, and thank you, Brooke, for putting this together and shining a spotlight on preservation as a revitalization tool. Again, we appreciate all the support that you've given us through the years and
Of course.
providing this opportunity. I mean, I would agree with what everyone said. I would say, first off, I'll just say it. I would uncap the state historic tax credit and see what happens. Virginia figures out how to do $100 million a year. I bet we could figure out if we really tried.
Yep.
And I think that district by district, legislators would say, "Wow, this is having a hell of an impact. We gotta keep this thing going." So I would do that. The second one is, I think preservationists in general have to become more comfy with alternative ways of protecting neighborhoods and communities outside of local historic districts. They've worked for a while. There's some good things about them, but there's a lot of negative publicity and mythology about them, and people are confused by them. We have been trying to actually really invest in that. And in the city of Brunswick in Western Maryland, we're working to try and establish a conservation district, which is sort of like a hybrid model that allows people to protect the things that matter about their community and shape the future of that community, while also not kind of going too far or getting to the point where we just wouldn't have any protection. So it's a half measure. And I think some preservationists would feel like we're not going far enough, but I mean, one of the jokes I've heard is that it's not an integrity Olympics. Like, you don't get a gold medal if everything's perfect. And it's far better to have a community that's livable, walkable, and that retains its essential character and becomes sort of this sustainable, just place that we want it to be. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. So I do think that those are important things. And again, I appreciate you for giving us this time to talk tonight.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thanks everybody who tuned in, and we will be sending around a link to this on YouTube, as well as the slide presentations as well, so that everybody has them. Really grateful for all the work that all of you do. There is a huge affordable housing crisis that the state of Maryland is facing right now. And we will not solve that without dedicated thinking about preservation and about using our existing structures. And so, I'm grateful for the work that you all are doing, and for the work that everyone on this call is doing to make sure that we can rise to meet some of these challenges. So thank you so much. thanks everybody out there for watching tonight. Stay safe, be well, and everybody keep in touch. So good night. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.